Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you'll see from what I'm about to say, I feel slightly embarrassed about being here and talking about ex post assessment, because I don't think that very much of what we do is actually ex post assessment. We are, however, advocates of such evaluations and have had reason on many an occasion to bring the Department for Transport for task for not carrying out the evaluations that it said it would do on its various programmes. We're advocates because we do think that they've got an important role to play as part of the review process throughout and beyond the life of a programme, and that they can, we hope they can, should be able to provide a better understanding of the impact of transport programmes, and would help decision making and prioritisation in the future. We've noticed in the last, I suppose, 18 months, a growing interest within the UK in ex post assessments and in evaluation. But as the discussion this afternoon and this morning's brought out, I think there probably are issues about whether the right things are being measured. And I think there's probably also a communication issue with people like MPs on the Public Accounts Committees and other key stakeholders as to whether the way in which impacts and benefits are measured is understandable and something that people can relate to in their real lives. Okay, briefly, for those who are... sorry, I pressed the wrong one. There we go. Okay, for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we're independent of government. We report to the Public Accounts Committee, which Tom has mentioned, and we both audit government departments' financial accounts, and we carry out specific projects looking at major areas of expenditure, and they're known as value for money reports. We cover the whole of government, so our reports cover defence, health, education, as well as transport and other areas. So that means that we produce about 3 reports a year on transport. So we have to focus on the areas of greatest expenditure and of risk. Our reports are written for a lay audience, and they have a specific purpose in that they are used for the Public Accounts Committee to hold senior officials within the department to account for their decisions and action. Our work in transport covers the full range of activities. But as I said, we've got to focus on the key areas of expenditure and the key risks. And there's been an awful lot of money spent on rail infrastructure in recent years and going forward. So we've done quite a lot of work on that area most recently. I'd say with the exception of one of the reports we've done recently, most of the reports we've done have been akin to progress reports rather than ex post evaluations. It's in large part a reflection of the stage that many of the reports are at, the programmes are at. So, for example, we have Crossrail, which is just under £15 billion, and that's to a new railway line across the top of London, and that's still in construction. We have Thameslink, which again, I think the total investment is something like £6 or £7 billion, and that's, I suppose, a fairly massive refurbishment of a north-south link through London, and that's still in the construction phase. And then, of course, we've got High Speed 2, which is a new railway line, which is still being planned, which is estimated that if the full programme is put into place, would cost just under £43 billion, and that would run from London to somewhere in the north, yet to be determined. I think the decisions are still being made about that. Okay, so typically what we've started to do is to examine these programmes at key stages. So the first stage would be when the investment decision is taken. And at that stage, we would examine the business case to see whether the decision has been based on sound evidence. We would demand forecasts. And the strategic case, what are the department's objectives for carrying out the programme? The most recent example we have done of that was of High Speed 2 last year, last May think we published it. We highlighted some issues around the development of the business case, which I think had already been fairly well publicised in terms of errors in the modelling, which had sought to make the demand forecasts larger than they actually, well, we've still got to see how they turn out in reality, but they had to be corrected downwards. But the main conclusion we made there, which got a fair amount of publicity, was that we felt that the department had not articulated the strategic case well. It had not made clear what its objectives were. It talked a lot about rebalancing economies and seeking to regenerate areas of deprivation, but it hadn't gone into detail of those. And there were also arguments made about capacity and congestion on other parts of the line closer to London. Partly in response to that, the department revised its business case in October this year and clarified its objectives around the capacity and the congestion on the southern end. It's also set up a growth task force to look at how the project would contribute to rebalancing the economy. So that's an example of where we look at an investment decision. We've reported recently on Thameslink and Crossrail during construction, and there typically we report on progress to time and to budget. For both of those, the reports were fairly positive. There have been changes for both of them in terms of budgets, largely as a result of the recession and the government spending review in 2010. In those reports, we also look at how the demand forecasts are shaping up. Both rail links are around London, and there's been massive population explosion in London in recent years, and that's set to continue. So again, it looks as if those railways will have passengers to serve when they are fully operational and running at full strength. Okay, I suppose the next one I want to talk about. Yeah, High Speed 1 is probably the best example of a report that's closest to an ex-post assessment or an evaluation. We carried out that study in 2012, a couple of years after the line had opened. So basically, this is the railway line that runs from the Channel Tunnel up into St Pancras in London. I think it was a good learning curve for us because we experienced the same frustrations and the same difficulties that people have talked about today in terms of when is the right time to conduct such a study, the availability of information, and how do you measure wider economic impacts. So I think it's probably worth spending a little bit of time going through some of those issues. Firstly, the timing. It wasn't the right time to look at any of it in some ways. I mean, the three things we wanted to look at, if I take the third one first, was whether the department had achieved value for money in the sale of the line, because the department had sold its interest in the line, the infrastructure on which High Speed 1. And it was a good time for us to examine that because the sale had recently been completed. All the information was available, and the people were still around who we could talk to, we could interview, we could question about how they went about things, what judgments they had made, what advice they had taken, and how they had reached decisions. So that was fine in relation to timing and availability of information. Delivery to time, the first one of those points. That too wasn't so much of a problem because the department and the delivery body, London Continental Railways, clearly had a timetable. They had, I suppose, an optimistic end date, which they didn't make, but they did make the final end date. So we were able to conclude that they had delivered the project on time. In terms of looking at the budget and costings, that was more problematic because that information was held by the delivery body, London Continental Railways. it had evolved during the life of the project. So it had been, I suppose, a project sponsor and manager during construction when the costs were incurred. But that it had gone through that stage, had gone beyond that stage, and those people had moved on. Information had been archived, and so that proved to be quite difficult to get hold of that information and to be able to talk to people who could explain to us how that information was used and how to interpret it. So in some cases, we probably undertook that part of the work too late. In terms of whether the line was achieving the original objectives, it could be argued that we undertook that work too early. The department certainly thought we did. The line had been running for 2 years. It's standard in the UK, I'm not sure about other countries, to look at the transport benefits after 3 years of running, so they felt we were being a bit unfair. They also felt that we were being a bit unfair in terms of the wider economic impacts, because obviously these take a long time to come through. We felt that it was the right time for us to look at these things, because what we found was that the department did not have an evaluation framework in place for measuring these impacts, and it had not been collecting information along the line, throughout the programme. So we felt that they had missed an opportunity for some of the issues that people have talked about today, about observing what was happening during the project, getting a baseline. So we had quite a tussle with them about that. Moving on, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the measurement of wider economic impacts, because I think it has actually become quite a discussion of some prominence within the UK now, because it is increasingly being cited for major transformational projects where you can't justify the costs on transport benefits alone. Quite often they've been cited, as with HS2, as being for reasons other than transport. The departments face quite a lot of, I suppose, calls for justification of why it thinks those benefits and how those benefits will be delivered. But up to now, it hasn't been able to produce much quantitative evidence in relation to that. There have also been issues for other sectors, and other people involved in infrastructure more generally have raised questions about how do you prioritise between projects if they're not just serving transport or utility, or we have projects like the Thames Tideway in London, which is looking at the sewage system. How does government and how do decision makers decide where to put money? There's only a finite resource available. How do you decide whether it's a transport project or another type of project? And again, that I think is increasing interest in wider economic impacts. There have also been debates around, are all the benefits and costs captured? I think it's important to say here, we've been talking a fair bit about journey time savings and the economic theories that underpin some of the benefits that appear in business cases. I think it's probably fair to say that for a lay audience, sometimes those concepts are quite hard to understand. So I think that there's probably a communication issue when you're expecting taxpayers to invest large sums of money, that the reasons why need to be articulated in terms that they can relate to. And certainly the Public Accounts Committee has shown quite a lot of interest both in journey time savings and also on the question of whether all the benefits and costs are actually captured. So I suppose my concluding remarks are, I think I've seen that there's a greater appetite for conducting ex post assessments, certainly within the UK in recent months. I'd be interested in your views as to whether that's likewise throughout Europe and America. But I think there's also this question about are the tools and techniques that are available to us able to satisfy the demands of lay audiences such as the taxpayers and those who hold departments to account. So thank you.